Okay, real talk. Companies these days have started calling themselves carbon positive. And honestly, it sounds less like a sustainability goal and more like a medical test report, which you definitely don't want to hear. Carbon positive. Like, imagine your friend telling you, hey, bro, I got my medical test done. And you know what? I am carbon positive. And then what do you say? Oh, well, congratulations, get well soon, or maybe offset it. So, today we are going to fix all of this confusion, right from net zero, climate neutral, carbon positive, carbon negative. What do all of these words actually mean? And why do companies always use them wrong? Don't worry, in today's video, we are going to understand all of these terms related to carbon and climate. So watch this video till the end if you want to become the next climate pro in your company or want to crack that ESG and sustainability job interview. Hey guys, welcome back to Gen Sustainable. Gen Sustainable is a place where we decode all of these corporate jargons and translate them into human understandable language. And today we are back with yet another video where we are going to break down all of these terms related to climate and carbon, like carbon positive, climate neutral, carbon neutral, GHG emissions, scope 1, 2, 3, and whatnot. So watch this full video because you are going to be the next carbon pro in your organization if you understand all of these terms well. And you are also going to be that next superhero who cracks the ESG or sustainability job interview super quick. So let's get started. Okay, so now before we jump in and start throwing all of these climate and carbon terms left, right, and center, let's first make our lives little more easier. Now, all of these terms which you keep listening to in sustainability reports or on LinkedIn or here generally people talk about them can be broken down into 5 simple buckets. And once you understand the theme of these 5 simple buckets and which term falls under which bucket, life is going to be super easy for you from there. So the first bucket is the emissions bucket, which has stuff like GHG emissions, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, all of it which is related to the actual carbon emissions. Then the next bucket is the net zero family, and all of those confusing cousins live together in this bucket. So if you hear all of these terms like carbon positive, carbon negative, climate neutral, climate positive, and whatnot, be rest assured they fall under this net zero family. The third bucket is carbon market, and here you'll find all of these terms like carbon offset, carbon credit, voluntary versus compliance market, and whatnot. So basically, if you hear anything like trading carbon, and yes, it's a thing, people do trade carbon emissions. So all of them fall under this bucket of carbon markets. The fourth bucket is of product level terms. Now here all of these terms like LCA, cradle to cradle, cradle to grave, basically anything that defines a product fall in this fourth bucket. And the fifth bucket has all of these global concepts related to carbon and emissions like the Paris Agreement or net zero pathways, net zero strategy, global warming potential, carbon budget, and whatnot, everything that shapes the climate policy. So from here, whenever you listen to any word related to carbon or emissions, first step, try to identify which bucket it falls in, and then simply try to break and analyze its meaning. So now that we broadly know these 5 buckets, let's go ahead and understand terms in each of these buckets one by one. So now let's begin with the emissions bucket. And the first term is the most simple term, which is carbon emissions. So what are carbon emissions? So carbon emissions are the gases which get released into the atmosphere when we burn any fuel or carry out any day-to-day activity. So think about it like this, that your daily life has a digital footprint. So for the amount of time that you spend scrolling on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, that is your digital footprint. But then similarly, when you do your day-to-day activities like eat food, wear clothes, do shopping, all of this has carbon footprint because in some way or the other, there are carbon emissions associated with all of these activities. The next one is greenhouse gases or GHGs. Now, any gas which has the potential of trapping the Earth's heat into its atmosphere are greenhouse gases. So the most common or the most famous greenhouse gas is CO2, and the rest of the greenhouse gases are methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons, and HFCs. And to understand everything about GHG emissions, you can watch this video here where I have explained everything about GHG emissions and how to calculate them. The next one is your carbon footprint. So like we just spoke about the digital footprint, you also have your own carbon footprint. So take an example of the food that you eat every day. Now this food obviously is grown somewhere. If it is vegetarian food, it grows on fields or farms, or the fruits are grown on trees. So for the entire agricultural activity, you require fertilizers, which causes CO2 emissions. Once the grains are harvested, these grains are transported from the agricultural land to the market. So during this entire period of transition, there are CO2 emissions. So when you cook your food, you have to burn some type of fuel for it. It's either LPG gas, cylinder, or like in ancient times, the food was burnt on coal or wood. All of these heating and burning activities cause CO2 emissions. It adds up to your total carbon footprint. So like you have your digital footprint. When you use all of these digital apps, you similarly have carbon footprint when any activity that you do in your day-to-day life causes carbon emissions. The next one is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Now to understand it very easily, let's take an example. Suppose you own your own chai stall. So when you burn fuel on your chai stall to prepare your tea, that is scope 1 emission which is coming because you are burning that fuel for your own operations in your own company. Now suppose your chai stall is purchasing electricity from somewhere, maybe from grid or maybe from its landlord. Now this purchased electricity goes into scope 2 emissions. And then what about scope 3 emissions? Scope 3 emissions are anything which happen beyond the control of your own operations. So suppose your customers are traveling all the way from 5 kilometers in their own vehicle or in public transport to come to your chai stall and have tea. So then the emissions which is caused due to the running of these vehicles are the scope 3 emissions. Similarly, you might be purchasing raw materials required in your chai stall like milk, tea powder, water, all of this from somewhere, and it's traveling like 100 kilometers from its origin. So the emissions caused in the transportation is all calculated in the scope 3 emissions. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions are as simple as this. Alright, so now as the emissions basics are clear, let's move to the next bucket, which is the net zero family. And honestly, understanding this net zero family is the most complicated one because all the children look so alike, as if they are twins or triplets or quadruplets, or I don't know how many of them look similar. But once you try to understand the basic concept, then you understand the difference of all of them. So now first let's understand what is net zero. Now net zero is when a company has almost zero or near to zero carbon emissions, or maybe if the company had say 100 tons of emission in the baseline year, so now if they have even reduced it by 90 or 95%, you can consider it as net zero emissions. So net zero emissions is that company has totally remolded their processes so as to not cause any emissions in the entire system. So to understand net zero emissions, take this example that when you are trying to be healthy, you are actually hitting the gym each day, eating healthy food each day, and also getting 10 hours of sleep each day. You are doing everything which is healthy, then it's like net zero emissions. But then with net zero emission, you have its twin, which is carbon neutral, and oftentimes people do get confused between these two twins. But now carbon neutral is when you actually do emissions, but then you offset these emissions by planting trees somewhere. That is carbon neutral. So for example, if your company is causing 100 tons of emissions due to its activities, but then you're also planting trees that can absorb 100 tons of emissions, then you're actually carbon neutral. So it's similar to you're eating pizza each day, but then you're also going to the gym to burn the amount of calories that you got from the pizza, then it's similar to carbon neutral. So now I hope you understand the difference between net zero versus carbon neutral. In net zero, you do not cause any emissions, whereas in carbon neutral, you cause emissions, but then you offset it by taking some measures. So now let's understand what is carbon negative. Carbon negative is like your overachiever friend who says that, he or she studied only for 1 hour but then ends up topping the exam in the entire class. So in carbon negative, you combine both of the principles of net zero and carbon neutral together. So here your company is not causing any emissions, but then at the same time it's also planting trees so that the emissions which are not caused by them are also getting absorbed. So this is carbon negative, causing negative emissions in the atmosphere. So you're actually causing mathematically negative emissions in the atmosphere. Now the next term is carbon positive or climate positive, and this is super confusing because you must be thinking that if carbon negative is causing net negative emissions mathematically, carbon positive is something which causes net positive emissions, which means that you're actually causing emissions, but then it's not that way. Carbon negative and carbon positive both mean the same, that your company is not causing emissions and plus it's taking measures to absorb emissions elsewhere. And this is where most companies end up not just confusing their stakeholders and customers, but also confusing themselves. So if you are into sustainability and ESG, understand that both of these terms mean the same and that broadly you can stick to one single term and not confuse your stakeholders by using both of these terms together or interchangeably. Okay, so now that we have discussed the net zero family and all of its dramatic cousins, let's go to the carbon market family, which actually makes the life of net zero family possible. So let's understand the first term, which is carbon offsetting. Now, carbon offsetting is literally like a company saying that I am causing emissions for this particular activity, but I am offsetting it by paying for a project somewhere else. So for example, if your company is causing 100 tons of GHG emissions, it is paying to actually plant trees in a forest where 100 tons of carbon emissions can be absorbed. So it's like if you're eating junk food today, but at the same time you're taking steps tomorrow to burn these calories, it is similar to carbon offsetting. Now, carbon offsetting can either be done by companies by funding projects which are related to forestation activities or related to tree plantation drives or renewable energy projects or recycling projects or anything similar which can help reduce carbon emissions in some other part of the world. So this is carbon offset. And carbon offsetting is the most controversial topic out there because not every offsetting project is as effective as it claims to be. So for example, you might say that I will invest in a project to reduce 100 tons of the GHG emissions which I am causing, but the project in which you are investing might not actually be as efficient to absorb 100 tons of carbon emissions. It's like when you say that, hey, I'll eat junk food but then go to the gym to burn the calories, but then in reality you actually don't end up to the gym every day or you don't end up burning as many calories as you consumed. So this is why carbon offset becomes controversial and challenging most of the times. Then the next one is carbon removal. And carbon removal also sounds similar to carbon offsetting, but here CO2 is actually removed from the atmosphere and not offsetted in some other part of the world. So for example, when you're actually planting trees to remove the carbon emissions that you are causing, then it's carbon removal. But if you are funding some other projects which is planting trees, then it is carbon offsetting. So carbon removal can either be done through nature-based solutions or tech-based solution. Now, nature-based solution includes simply planting trees or protecting forest, and tech-based solutions can include something like direct air capture, biochars, or carbon capture and storage systems. So think of these tech-based solutions like a vacuum cleaner, wherein they actually pump out the carbon from the atmosphere and store into their system. Then the next one is carbon credits. And carbon credits are actually the currency which is used to offset carbon emissions. So for example, if the carbon credit says 1 ton of CO2 emission is equal to 1 rupee, then you actually pay those many number of rupees as much amount of CO2 emission you're causing and buy the carbon credit certificates. So for these carbon credits, there are two types of markets. One is the voluntary market and one is the compliance market. So in the voluntary market, companies pay by their own will to buy carbon credits to offset their emissions. But in compliance market like the EU ETS, it is mandated by the government to buy carbon credits for the amount of CO2 emissions that you're causing. And and these carbon credits are further utilized to cause for activities which further reduce GHG emissions. So you can buy carbon credits from a company which offsets your CO2 emission by planting trees somewhere. Or some companies also have their own carbon credit fund wherein they keep aside some amount of money which is equivalent to the carbon emissions that they are causing, and then invest this money in projects related to renewable energy or any other innovation driven projects which can reduce their GHG emissions. So now I think once the difficult part of the topic is over, let's move to the more simpler concepts which are related to product level carbon terms. Now the first term is product carbon footprint. So similar to your own carbon footprint, the product carbon footprint calculates the carbon footprint of a particular product. So take for example, if you're manufacturing this t-shirt. Now to manufacture this t-shirt, you first need to grow and harvest cotton crops. So that can cause some sort of emissions. Then the cotton is harvested and transported to a manufacturing site, which again causes some emissions. Then during the manufacturing process, it again causes some more emissions. And after the t-shirt is manufactured, it then goes to the distributors and to the markets where it causes even more emissions. And by the time it reaches your wardrobe, it causes even more emissions. So all of these emissions which are caused by the product comes into an umbrella of the product carbon footprint. And to calculate the product carbon footprint, you need to carry out life cycle assessment. And you can watch the full video of life cycle assessment here. Then the next term is carbon intensity of a product. Now suppose you are working in a factory which causes total of 100 tons of GHG emissions. But then this factory has manufactured 10 t-shirts. So then the carbon emission intensity per t-shirt is 10 tons because one t-shirt is causing 10 tons of emissions. So 10 t-shirts is causing a total of 100 tons of emissions. So that is carbon intensity of a product. So now that we understand all of these carbon related terms, let's zoom out a bit and understand the global concepts or global terms related to carbon and emissions. So the first one is carbon budget, and carbon budget is the humanity's remaining amount of CO2 emissions that we can emit before we get to the dangerous levels of global warming. It's like having a limited credit card balance, that if you have a credit limit of 1 lakh, you cannot spend beyond 1 lakh. So similarly, Earth also has a limited capacity of carbon that it can store in itself, and we are fast approaching to that budget due to all of the emissions that we are causing. So to say to remain well under 1.5 degree warming, scientists say that we have very little carbon budget remaining with us. So when countries commit to net zero emissions, it's similar to like saying I am not spending any money on my credit card to maintain the balance that I have on my credit limit. The next one is very important, which you keep hearing everywhere, which is Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius. So in 2015, almost every country in the world agreed to keep their global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and try to keep it even below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius might sound very little, but in climate terms, it's very, very huge. It's the difference between some coral reefs surviving versus all of the coral reefs out there dying. Or it can be the difference between heat wave making us uncomfortable versus heat wave becoming life-threatening. Or you can take it as some glaciers melting versus having severe water shortage all around the globe. The next one is net zero pathway and SBTi. Now net zero pathway is the roadmap which a company prepares to reduce its GHG emissions by 90 to 95%, or the strategy it follows to go to net zero emissions. And it can have milestones like 2030 target, 2040 target, and then the final net zero date. And then we have SBTi, which is Science-Based Target Initiative, which checks that if these net zero targets are actually based on climate science or are just fancy marketing gimmicks. So basically, SBTi forces companies to stop saying that we'll eventually reach net zero emissions and to rather have some documented evidence which proves that they can actually reach net zero emissions. The next term is tripping point. Now, tripping point is the point beyond which, if the climate changes, then there would be irreversible damage. Like once you reach this point, there is no going back. So some examples could be something like melting of major glaciers and ice caps, or total collapse of the Amazon forest, or death of all of the coral reefs. Once it's gone, it can never come back. It's like dropping your phone in water. At first you feel nothing, but then slowly the screen is gone and eventually there's permanent damage. And that is why maintaining global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius is very, very important. And if you must be thinking that why these global terms and concepts matter, because these are the ones who shape national and global level climate policies. So if you understand these terms, you understand the why and how the global and national level climate policy and climate strategy would be shaped. So that's all for today's video. I hope you found the video very, very useful and insightful, and I'm sure you would be using these terms now in your day-to-day life, may it be in your organization or during your interview. Until we come back with another such interesting video, like, share and subscribe to this video and Gen Sustainable, and do let me know in the comments below what are some other terms that you would like me to cover and what are some other topics that you would like to see on Gen Sustainable. So till we come back with another impactful video, stay climate positive, stay Gen Sustainable. Bye bye.